Hey, what's up everybody? This is GC Kinsey, and today I'm going to be talking about how passing culture fails us all. Passing. Such a loaded term, right? If you've spent any time in and around queer circles, there's a good chance you've heard this word and some of the discourse around it. So, what does it mean? In the context I'm talking about, passing is when someone is assumed to be part of a group that has more privilege, more social capital, a better standing in society than they actually have. This could be passing as white when you're actually a person of color. Passing as able-bodied and healthy when you're actually disabled or chronically ill. Passing as neurotypical when you're actually neurodivergent. Passing as straight when you're actually gay, bi, pan, ace, or any other non-hetero orientation. And the one I'll be focusing on in this video, passing as cis when you're actually trans. And really, for trans people, the idea of passing is a little more complex than that, because there are sort of two different levels to it. So there's passing as cis, meaning that if you are a trans woman, people assume you're a cis woman. If you're a trans man, people assume you're a cis man. You're basically indistinguishable from cis people. But then there's also just passing as your gender, whether people think you're cis or not. And this definition is a little more expansive because it could actually include non-binary people, whereas the first definition, not so much. The idea of us passing as cis doesn't really make sense. But with this other definition, we could in theory be said to pass as non-binary. Whether that actually happens in practice so much, I don't know. So why is passing such a frequently discussed and sometimes controversial and heavily debated topic in the trans community? Well, to understand that, we have to go beyond just the idea of passing itself and talk about something else called passing culture. Passing isn't just a thing that happens or a goal that trans people want to reach. It's considered a necessity for being treated with basic respect and even for personal safety. And to be clear, I am talking about that first definition of passing here, passing as cis. You essentially have to pass as a cis person of your gender to be treated like a human. And that gets into what I mean when I talk about how passing culture fails us all. My issues with passing culture can be boiled down to three main points. 1. Passing is in the eye of the beholder. I think a lot of people mistakenly believe that passing is something you can control. That if you do all the right things in your transition, then you will magically pass by the end of it. But that is simply not true. Are there things you can do to increase your chances of passing? Yeah, absolutely. But will those things guarantee that you pass in every situation? Unfortunately, no. Because passing isn't up to us. It's up to other people and how they see us. Every time you interact with another person, one of the things they're doing is trying to figure out what your gender is. And that's kind of happening in their head automatically. And that's something that's ingrained in us to do from a very young age. Figure out what the other person's gender is and use that to guide our interactions. Because like it or not, gender is considered an important part of how we relate to each other in society. So when that person is looking at you and deciding what gender they think you are, they're making a judgment call. You're not getting inside their head or directing their thoughts. The most you can do is send them signals, maybe through your clothing or your hairstyle or your speech, your mannerisms, your movements, and hoping that they pick up on those signals correctly. Which is exactly the problem. When it comes to trans and non-binary people, sometimes also intersex people, and even gender non-conforming cis people, those signals can get misinterpreted. If there's a contradiction in what you're expecting, if there's a sort of mismatch between the signals in someone's presentation versus their body or their voice, that's the kind of thing that can make you go, wait, stop, gender does not compute, and that is what leads to someone not passing. Here's the thing, not everyone is able to pass no matter how hard they try. They could be doing all the right things and still get the wrong interpretation. And what can they really do about that? Also, not every trans person wants to pass as cis. Some of us are totally okay with being obviously trans and very out and proud. But when we live in a society that rewards those who pass and punishes those who don't, well, suddenly the whole idea of not trying to pass or not wanting to pass doesn't work so well, does it? Bottom line, people are treated in different ways based on something that is entirely outside their control. And that's not fair. 2. Passing culture upholds a binary gender framework. Like I mentioned in the beginning, if we talk about passing in terms of passing as cis, that leaves out non-binary people entirely. We can either pass as non-binary, which means we're not passing as cis, or we could pass as a cis man or cis woman, which means we're not passing as whatever our actual gender is or lack thereof. So when we live in a passing culture where it's impossible for non-binary people to pass, that puts binary trans men and women at an advantage. It almost feels weird to talk about any kind of trans people having an advantage in this hellscape of a society we live in, and make no mistake, trans people of all kinds are generally treated like crap. But when we're strictly talking about passing culture, binary trans folks do have the upper hand. And that leads to some really terrible outcomes. For non-binary people, it means we're treated the same way all non-passing trans people are. Not great. For binary trans men and women who don't pass as cis, they're not treated great either, and sometimes they get conflated with non-binary people because they look androgynous to the average passerby. So that can sometimes breed resentment in them for non-binary people because we confuse the cis people and make it harder for them to pass. But remember what I said before? Passing is in the eye of the beholder. So it's not non-binary people's fault if a trans man or a trans woman doesn't pass. And it's not that trans man or that trans woman's fault either. And finally, for the trans people who do pass as cis, there can be a sort of divide in the community between them and their non-passing, including non-binary counterparts. They blend in with the cis people, so why would they live their lives as out and proud and trans if they don't have to? Why would they associate with the rest of us? It's not that they necessarily have anything against us, it's just that they're well aware that if they are out as trans, that could put them in danger. So what happens is this very binary view around passing as cis divides and causes conflict within the trans community, which is horrible because we're already at such a disadvantage in society at large. We don't need further division amongst ourselves. But rather than uniting against the system, and yes, I do mean system, we're constantly being pitted against each other. We're forced into a position where we're torn between our own well-being and what's best for the community as a whole. Even if we want to break free of that, passing culture puts us in jeopardy if we try. And that's not fair either. 3. The opposite of passing is failing. This is more of an issue I have with the word passing itself. If you don't pass, does that mean you fail at gender? At being a valuable human? I mean, there's a really big implication here that I don't like. And I think that message gets subconsciously absorbed within the trans community because we are so hyper aware of passing culture and what it means to live in it. We all know that people who don't pass, or in other words, fail, are treated like second-class citizens at best and subhuman at worst. And the cost of that failure can be our happiness, respect, safety, livelihood, and even our lives. So that makes a lot of trans people desperate to pass at any cost. I've heard several trans people say that they would have made different choices in their transition if passing weren't so critical to their safety. And that makes me so sad because your transition should be about what you want. It should be for you, not about how other people are going to treat you. But sadly, that's not the world we live in, at least not yet. And this is something I struggle with personally. I'm one of those non-binary people that the binary structure of passing culture doesn't fit. I'm one of those trans people who doesn't pass as cis and doesn't want to because that would be erasing my truth. But I'm well aware of what that means and how I'm going to have to plan the rest of my transition and really the logistics of my life around the reality of a non-passing future. I've seen too many people take their lives because they were afraid of what their own non-passing futures might look like. I've seen too many people whose lives were taken from them because of transphobic hate. Among the ones who survive, I've seen too many people talking about how they'll never be happy because they are still visibly trans at the end of the day and therefore their transition has failed. And I can't help but think that the very word passing contributes to a lot of that. And that is also not fair. I want to make one thing very clear just so there's no misunderstanding. I don't think passing in and of itself is a bad thing. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be seen and respected as your gender. There is nothing wrong with wanting to blend in with cis people. Those are things a lot of trans people want, and that is completely legit. If you're one of those people, please do not think this video is a criticism of you. What I'm criticizing is a society that makes passing something people have to do to be treated with the bare minimum of respect. That breeds toxicity and puts a lot of unreasonable expectations on the trans community, and it's just wrong. So how do we change it? Here are a few ideas. 1. Increase visibility. The first step in understanding is exposure. So we need more visibility for the trans and non-binary community in society. And when I talk about the community, I mean all of us. There's a tendency for the most visible or sort of the most high-profile trans people to be the ones who are also the most easily digestible for cis people. The ones who can demonstrate that, hey, we're not so different from you after all. So what does that mean for the rest of us? The non-passing trans folks, the gender non-conforming trans folks, the non-binary trans folks. A lot of times it means we're not seen at all. Or when we are, we're viewed more as stereotypes than as actual people. And to be clear, there's very little representation of trans people, period. So we have got to improve this across the board. There are annual community events designed to help with this, such as Trans Day of Visibility every March 31st, Non-Binary People's Day, July 14th, National Coming Out Day, October 11th, and Pride Month all throughout June. And there are lots of initiatives that have been started in schools and workplaces and other social settings to increase awareness of trans people. But overall, visibility for us is still just beginning. And visibility alone isn't enough. It has to be supported by something else. Which brings me to my next point. 2. Improve education. When you make a community visible, when you make people aware of us, you've got to also help them understand us. Otherwise, they're probably just going to make assumptions that lead to confusion and judgment and ultimately a lack of respect. So you can't just increase visibility and call it a day. You have to improve education as well. And when it comes to passing culture specifically, that education should involve showing people what that pressure to pass does to us, how much it harms and sometimes even kills us, how it keeps a lot of us from truly being ourselves. If you look at the statistics published each year for Trans Day of Remembrance, which honors trans folks who lost their lives due to transphobic violence, you'll see which segments of the community are most affected. And it is very disproportionately trans women and trans feminine folks of color. But the numbers alone don't tell the full story. They don't show how oftentimes that violence stems from someone who happened to not pass in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we need that education desperately. We need people to understand how and why different genders under the trans umbrella are affected by passing culture in different ways. We need people to understand how gender and passing status intersect with other factors like race or age or body type or disability or where the person lives or their socioeconomic status and all kinds of other things. Education is a major part of what supports and protects trans people once we become visible. because visible can also mean vulnerable. So we need to make sure that shining a spotlight on trans issues means that we will be respected and uplifted rather than subjected to further harm. And when it comes to healing some of the harm caused by passing culture, that brings me to my last point. 3. Reframe the concept. Once we have visibility, once we have education, that gives us the tools we need to start thinking about things in a different way. And that's what I would like to propose we do with the concept of passing and passing culture. Earlier, I mentioned that the word passing in and of itself could be harmful because it carries that implication of failing. So what if we think about this through a different lens? I've seen some people use a different word in place of passing, which I actually dropped myself a couple of times earlier in this video, and that is blending. It's certainly a nicer word in that the opposite of blend isn't fail, but is it a perfect substitute? I'm not sure. I feel like blending actually has a stronger implication toward the idea of passing as cis rather than passing as your gender, because it literally means blending in with cis people. So in that sense, passing is actually a more versatile word, even though it's not as kind. So what I would like to propose is flipping the whole concept of passing on its head and talking about perception. This does a couple of things. First, it takes the onus off the trans person and puts it on the outside observer where it belongs. If passing is in the eye of the beholder, and it has nothing to do with what we can control, then doesn't it make a lot more sense to talk about how that beholder perceives us instead? Second, it not only gets rid of that pass-fail dichotomy, but it also leaves things very open and inclusive, particularly of non-binary people who get left out of the whole idea of passing as cis. So what does this look like in practice? Instead of saying a trans woman passes, you would say she's perceived as a woman. Or if you wanted to get more specific about it, you could say she's perceived as a cis woman, if that's the case. On the flip side, instead of saying she doesn't pass, you would say something like, oh, that cashier at the mall today didn't perceive her as a woman. So annoying. And you see how that takes the responsibility of how she's perceived off of her and puts it onto the cashier instead? That is exactly what we're trying to do. We're reframing our language to make it explicitly clear that none of us can control how our gender is perceived. And if it's not perceived correctly, then that's not our fault. What would you suggest to change the passing culture we live in into one that is more affirming and respectful? What are your experiences with passing culture, and has it ever failed you? Do you have any questions about all of this? Please drop a comment below. I would love to hear from all of you. I would also love to talk about the idea of passing in a lot of the other areas that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, such as orientation, race, physical and mental health, etc. But I don't have personal experience in all of those areas. So if you do, and you would be interested maybe in having a conversation or doing some sort of collaborative project about that, please let me know. I mean, maybe this video could be the start of a whole series on the idea of passing culture in different areas of society. The idea for this video started from an Instagram post that I made a while back, which I have linked in the description. And if you want to connect with me on Instagram or on any other social media, I am GC Kinsey across all platforms. If you're interested in other vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, I have lots more of those on this channel, as well as cosplay music videos and makeup tutorials. So stick around, watch something else, like and subscribe, show your support, and make sure you don't miss out on anything new. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot, and I will see you on the next one.